Live. It is 6 o'clock and still sunny in New Mexico. It is 8 o'clock, probably a little darker, where Tyler is. The topic of the conversation today will be thermal effects in riflescopes. I'll give you guys a little bit of a background on why we're talking about this in a little bit. But before we do that, I'll bring Tyler on. Some of you may remember him. He's visited with me in the past. And then I'll tell you a little bit of an unrelated story that came to my head, and then we'll get going. All right, Mr. Tyler Patner.
Good to see you.
Likewise. So for background, Tyler is an air gun guy. And not like me, I like shooting air guns, and I spend more money on them than I should. Tyler is a serious air gun guy. And it's a slightly different way of thinking about shooting, just because of the distances involved. So there are things that Tyler routinely pays attention to that I don't even think of, and which is why he's here. But before we get to that, I just got off the plane last night. I get on a plane again during the weekend. That's my life. And the day before yesterday, a friend of mine's dad passed away. I'm at that age where all of my friends, our parents are not in the best of health, and nobody knows how long it's going to go. So I got home late last night. Everybody was already asleep, and I was just sitting there reminiscing. I hope to make it to the funeral, which is tomorrow, but there's no way I can do another plane now. And I was remembering a story. So I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious. It just so happened I've been to a lot of different religion-related events where I have to look interested and that sort of stuff. Sounds familiar, Tyler? You may have been to one of those. Yeah,
I identify. Yes.
Exactly right. So, there was a phase in my life in my 20s where I knew that in order to make it safe for everybody else, it's not a bad thing for me to have a nice flask with something good in my inside jacket pocket. So it was some event had to do with my friend's family. His uncle was a rabbi. It was very profound and heartfelt and very interesting, and I was dying there. So I quietly made my way to a distant corner, fished in the pocket for my little flask with very, very nice Celt cognac. If you have not tried Celt cognac, if you're cognac people, I highly recommend it. It's called Celt Tour de Monde. They ship that thing. They ship that thing around the world and all that. And I started looking for a little glass to fill, and then I feel somebody tapping me on the shoulder. That's my friend's dad, the gentleman who passed away the day before yesterday. He was a very little guy, short guy, with two little BT paper glasses. He sensed where I was going. His sixth sense told me where there's going to be a nice cognac popping up in the middle of a religious ceremony while nobody's looking. And while I was making my way over to the distant corner so that nobody would yell at me, he was able to round up two little paper cups that normally in a Jewish temple would be used for like grape juice or menishevitz, which is like spoiled grape juice. And he and I had a nice cognac there in the middle of things. But that's not what I remembered. What I remembered, but there was a bunch of people who somehow sensed what was happening, and we, do our thing. And then I kind of turned, and with the corner of my eye, I sensed this storm of reproachful looks. I'm beginning to feel a little guilty. I was still young and impressionable. And Boris, that's the gentleman's name, he just kind of gave me a little go, ha. And we had another one. So to Boris's memory, this is not cognac. This is Irish whiskey, but he liked that too. So
Scotch. Yeah.
But anyhow, so with that background, John LaCourte's here. Good to see you, John. Mr. Cunt Bucket. Oh God, seriously, that's his luck. When he first showed up, I was hoping this meant something else. Right. No, but this gentleman always asks good questions.
All right, well, you get a pass. Actually, I think it's hilarious. So
it is.
That's
hilarious.
My kind of humor.
Every time he has a question, I have to verbalize the name. I'm thinking, that is why I do not extract audio and make it into a podcast.
It's a fair point.
Because how do I explain that one to Apple?
Right. Yes.
Yeah, so. But anyhow, so with that preamble, thank you guys for bearing with me. I'm feeling a little sentimental. I'm in my late 40s, so that's that stage in a man's life where I need to arrange for a carefully orchestrated midlife crisis, and I'm slowly setting up the framework for it, showing some additional emotional response that I never had and don't really have, and things like that, so that when I hit 50, my wife lets me go hunt in Africa. So that's my plan.
Okay, so that's the midlife crisis thing that you're doing.
I'm not into motorcycles. I have lots of nice guns. I mean, so I need to stage my midlife crisis so I can make it out to Africa.
Do you feel like the fact that you're recording this and then basically telling your wife what the playbook's going to be is going to hurt you?
So I've been married for 20 years. Next month is actually 20 years. I love my wife, and she has an absolutely angelic personality. It takes that kind of personality to tolerate mine. And there is only one of those made.
Got it.
But, I've been married for 20 years, and my wife still doesn't know what I do for a living. Not because I haven't tried to tell her. Because she falls asleep the moment I start that speech again, no matter how I approach this. So when this live stream started, I waited for 3 minutes before I gave this whole speech. That basically means she probably lost focus.
Yep, that makes sense.
What I do here, she doesn't hugely care about. She does shoot though, pretty well.
Okay.
But the gearhead stuff, she doesn't care about.
Right.
So unless my brother, who does listen to this, tells her, and he knows better than that, right?
That I was going to say that'd be a violation. Yeah.
Well, he knows better than that, right? Then it's fairly safe. But anyhow, so to give you a little bit more background, and Tyler has somewhat limited time. He can be here for about 50 minutes, just under an hour, which should be more than enough. The reason I'm doing this, there was a thread on Sniper's Hide forum that started up where somebody at the PRS competition was complaining that the Vortex Razor Gen 3 shifts 0 with temperatures as it warms up. Okay. I thought it was a little bit far-fetched because in a well-made rifle scope, there are thermal shifts, and that's why Tyler is here. We'll talk about that in a moment. But shifting 0, unless something is truly screwed up inside the scope, should not be happening. Okay. If the scope is built so badly that it's happening, you will have other problems, right? In a well-made rifle scope, I shouldn't see it. Now, the way science is supposed to be done, you have theoretical knowledge, which I generally have. This is sort of what I do for a living. But you generally also need to follow it up with some sort of experiments. And when Tyler and I first ran into each other, about 3 years ago, something like that, he talked about thermal shifts in rifle scopes. I thought it was really interesting. So I took a couple of scopes I had at the time that I was playing with. One was a March, another one was a Tangent Theta, and I went started heating them up with a fan and looking at thermal shifts, etc. So I know they don't shift. But I didn't do it with the Razor Gen 3, and I will do that experiment anyway. From a theoretical standpoint, there should not be anything there to shift 0. Now, as that thread on Sniper's Hide further evolved and it came out who exactly was complaining and starting that rumor, I don't know the people involved. There's a couple other guys there who are no fans of Vortex, but who do know the people involved, basically said it's all horseshit, and the guy was just trying to badmouth Vortex for shits and giggles. Mm-hmm. A gentleman's name is, I believe, Keith Baker. That's how I'm interpreting what people are saying in the thread. I don't know the guy, have no clue. But badmouthing Vortex is sort of like a natural pastime for YouTubers. I just didn't know PRS guys do it as well.
I've seen this once or twice, yeah.
Yeah, I've told you stories. There is a prominent YouTuber, right, that talked about he had a Vortex scope and it was crap, and he sent it back. They sent him a new one. The new one is better, etc. Well, I happened to be at Vortex when they received that one. There was a big smudge on the objective lens. They cleaned it off, sent it back. He's talking about getting another scope and all that. So, fun stuff. But anyhow, be that as it may, thermal effects in rifle scopes do happen. And it is important to recognize what they are since the subject came up. With that in mind, I'm going to let Tyler talk a little bit about field target. If most of you guys are powder burners, you may not know much about field target, and they are uniquely sensitive to all these thermal stuff. And Tyler can give us a little bit of a primer on why.
Sure. Yeah. So field target is a shooting discipline done with air rifles. We shoot from distances to 10 to 55 yards and no further than that. With air guns in 177 caliber, predominantly at either 12 foot-pounds, so that's a 8-grain pellet at about 800 feet per second, or 20 foot-pounds, which is about a 10.5-grain pellet going a little over 900 feet per second, and just depends on what division you shoot. I guess within the confines of our conversation today, I'll just give you an idea. This is my my March Majesta 8 to 80, which I've been recently setting up. So you can see it's got a very large side parallax adjustment wheel here, as well as all the other.
I'm trying to make you
Okay.
look larger on the screen. Hold on.
I'm just about to use the scope as a baseball bat. No big deal.
No, hold on. Sorry, it's not working. Okay, I'll figure it out later. This will have to do.
Yeah, I'll try and figure out how to get this in here. But really, the important part is the parallax wheel for our purposes here today. But you can also see that I've got a kind of a fish tank temperature strip on the scope as well. And that's kind of how we would track any thermal changes. But the game in general is kind of like 3D archery, but with an air gun. So you have targets at unknown distances, and you use your scope's parallax adjustment to range find the target. So you're actually using the that little bit of a shift in and out of focus for your eye to decipher the distance. This is not struggling.
How is something doing? There we go. Okay.
Dang it! I thought I was going to get away with that sip for free. But
I saw you.
With that said, so unknown distances you range find with the rifle scope, which is why we have the big parallax wheel on there. And you're either, depending on what division you shoot in, we have a hunter division, which is kind of more entry level in terms of the equipment needed. And you're only allowed to use a 16 magnification scope. Obviously, you can adjust between like 4 and 16 if that's what your scope has, but you're only allowed to go up to 16, which means you have a much, you don't get the same depth of field benefits you do at high magnification.
So you kind of glossed over that a little bit. You just said range with the rifle scopes, but what you mean by ranging with the rifle scope is not what powder burners mean by ranging with the rifle scope. Because for us, ranging with a rifle scope means ranging things with a reticle. You're doing something entirely different.
Yeah, I think I said it, but yeah, so I go through this process with this side wheel, and I'll try and show you guys if I can get it in there. So you can see that there are little yardage markers on my wheel there. And that would be not quite every yard, but that would go out to 55 right there. And then you'd have 10 way up at the top there. So basically, I sit down in my backyard, or depending on where I am, with a tape, and I set out targets from 10 to 55 yards. I don't do every yard, but from like 10 to 20, you do every yard. From 20 to 30, you do every other yard. And then depending on the scope, you might do every other yard all the way out, like I do with the March. But other folks, depending on what scope you're using, you may not have that kind of clarity or what we refer to as snap, which is like going in and out of focus. You may not have good enough snap to get every other yard. You might have to do every 5 yards or 3 yards or something like that. But that's how we deduce range to then input our dope, right? So if I don't know the distance to target, I can't figure out my dope, right?
So you are essentially calibrating your sight focus wheel, and you need very, very shallow depth of field so that only one distance is in the exact focus, and then you calibrate your sight focus for that.
Exactly. That's the idea, yes.
So
go ahead.
Yeah. So since we're on it, and that's kind of the crux of the conversation, I'd like to point out a couple of things. We have John Lacorte here of Tracked Optics, and we have Scott Parks here of Vortex Optics. So if you have anything bad to say about Tracked or Vortex, now's the time before they escape.
Got it. Don't have anything bad to say about either. So good for
Yeah,
me.
that's a problem. They should make nice stuff, both of them. But so going back to your ranging method, this is where the thermal problems come in, because when you calibrate your sight focus, you calibrate it at a particular temperature.
Correct.
Okay.
So
What happens if the ambient temperature changes in some sort of a significant way?
this depends on the scope. And a lot of factors go into this, not just the make of the scope or the magnification level of the scope, but I've had multiple, I've used March for a number of years. I used Night Force before that. Every scope is different. And I do mean that in the way it sounds. Every single scope, even the same model from the same company, is different in this regard. Obviously, in terms of normal function, glass quality, clarity, most of the time you would not be able to tell a difference, especially when you get into that $3,000 plus price point. But from in this perspective, especially with temperature involved, everything behaves differently. To give you an example here, this is from a March 10 to 60 High Master. So you can see here, I have my normal marks in red, but you'll see over here on the sides, I have these marks in black. Those are actually my temperature shift marks. So I set the scope up at about 70 degrees during the summer. As the year progresses, obviously, we get colder mornings and it kind of warms up through the afternoon. So those colder mornings, you have that opportunity to see how the scope performs in, let's say, 50 degrees.
Wait a second. Did you say 70 degrees in the summer?
Sure.
I thought 70 degrees was more of a winter thing.
No, where you are. Yes, absolutely. Here in Ohio, we can get all 4 seasons in a day. But yeah, no. So, if you set the scope up at 70 and then you start running it into the fall, winter at let's say 40 to 50 degrees normally, you're going to see some differences, especially when you're talking about a high magnification scope. And so that's why I have those different marks there, because you all of a sudden are ranging a target that's supposed to be at 55 yards and you're coming up way past 55 yards and you're going, what's going on here? And then you shoot it, you dope you go, okay, well, it can't be further than 55 because it's not supposed to be. So you dope for 55 and you hit the target twice. And then you kind of come to this realization, something has moved, right? Just a question of what and how much.
Correct. So there's a question here that I kind of want to address from, again, Mr. Cuntbucket. Says, I've been wondering about those parallax wheels. Do you typically find the parallax from the factory to be accurate, specifically on cheaper scopes?
If you're talking about the marks that are on the factory side parallax adjustment wheel, no, just no. Within a range, I guess, like it'll tell you kind of round about 10, but most scopes that go down to, let's say, 10 yards or 10 meters actually go down maybe a yard closer than that in most cases.
Yeah.
But not all.
Correct. So this is, and these temperature stuff is actually one of the reasons you don't have it. So on the higher end scopes, the parallax wheel is generally pretty decently calibrated. A Vortex Razor Gen 3 of all of this higher end scopes is actually calibrated better than others. But I also know how they calibrate it, right? So they specifically do it. But it will really be only dead on if you're right around the temperature that they had in the lab. Any and every rifle scope, the side focus calibration will shift with temperature. If you look at the range of adjustment on the side focus chart, which Tyler just touched on, if it's labeled 10, it'll probably go to 9. And nearly all of them go beyond infinity. Why? To compensate for temperature differences. Because when it gets colder or hotter, you need that little bit of extra range of adjustment. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And one, especially in the airgun world, we get a lot, because you will get guys that will show up at a field target match that will have bought their scope wherever or online, and then think that if they're using a front parallax adjusting optic, right, that the marks on the objective bell are accurate, and then they use that to deduce the distance without doing any additional work to figure that out. And they don't hit very many targets. So,
so how big are the targets that you shoot?
Yeah, so we shoot at animal silhouettes mostly. You can get some other odd shapes and things, but the kill zone in the target, so the targets actually fall over when you hit them, that can vary in size from 3/8 of an inch up to 1.5 inches. And obviously by distance, right? So closer target's going to be
correct.
smaller. Yeah.
And just to be clear, so all of the shooting is unsupported. You can only use your body to support things, right? So from the level of complexity, it is a hideously difficult thing to do. If you have never tried it, go try to reliably hit a one-way target unsupported at 50 yards with a pellet that does this. Okay.
And then there's
before I tried to do that, I had a full head of hair, just so you know.
Yeah, there's that. So for as far as field target's concerned, though, that's part of the reason that Hunter Division exists, because you are allowed to use like a higher seat and use shooting sticks, and instead of click adjusting for your dope, you actually use hold over, hold under. So just some different rules, but trying to make the game more accessible for everybody.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I've been thinking about trying Hunter, but it's unless I get my kids into it, it's
maybe
it's rough. So John Lacourt is saying that was exactly what I was waiting to hear in regards to parallax and temperature changes. So John, if you have a specific question, please chime in. Otherwise, I'm going to bring up a diagram of what the rifle scope looks like and talk a little bit about what is exactly shifting and why I'm not surprised to see focus shifts. Tyler, do you see the zero shift with temperature with the scopes you use?
Not with the scopes I use. And I, quite frankly, I've never seen it in anything I've used, but I have seen it in a handful of very, well, I shouldn't say very inexpensive, but relatively speaking, inexpensive optics in the $300 to, let's say, $600 range. Okay. And in most of those instances, when I see it, I think there's something else wrong. You would know better than I on that. I have seen, and this is an interesting one. I did once have a scope that would have been very similar to a Citron S3 10 to 50. Mm-hmm. I saw it, but it was not the Citron variant of the scope. That actually, it was discernible a shift at certain temperature. And it would shift back actually in zero, which is, like I said, very, very rare, but that's about the only time I've seen one on something that I would consider to be a higher end optic.
Very interesting. I wonder why that would have been interesting to troubleshoot. All right, so question here. With the unsupported shooting rule, are bullpup platforms more favored for their weight distribution?
Oh, good question. Not really. Now, granted, I shoot a pretty short rifle. I would love to show it to you, but we don't want to get yanked off of certain platforms. So,
Tyler, I think you have a series of videos on different methods and improvements for field target, right?
We've put out a few, yeah, and there's a guy, Deadeye NC on YouTube, Philip, who puts out a bunch of videos, and you can see all sorts of different stuff there.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll look around and I'll see if I can find a video where Tyler and Tyler's rifle are shown. So you'll see it's kind of an interesting design. Much more. Yeah. Air guns are remarkably sophisticated, and for many of us coming into this from the other side, that was when I first saw it, that was a revelation.
Yeah, I think most people don't understand two things when it comes to shooting, and that's what accuracy really looks like and what a real match trigger is. Because until you've shot an Olympic air rifle, I don't care what you've shot. There's nothing like it. Maybe if you've shot a jewel trigger on a bench gun at 2 or 3 ounces, then you know what an Olympic trigger is like.
My hands all banged up. I can't feel a trigger like that. I think we've talked about that. But a friend of mine was an Russia's Olympic shooting team coach, and he was a world champion handgun 50-meter shooter back in the 70s, 80s. I know what kind of triggers they use, and it's yikes.
Yeah.
So, but where was I? Yeah. So let me put up a simple diagram, if you don't mind, and just to show you roughly what a scope looks like. I am partially putting this up to piece of Scott from Vortex because this is not his favorite scope, but he chose to be here. So there we go. So this is a picture I took many years ago in a manual for a hand-sold 4-16 by 56 scope, which was actually a pretty nice scope for its time. And the reason I took it is that They show how many lens elements they were, and now modern riflescopes frequently will have more. Right? I've had people who thought, oh, it's just a couple of lenses. Well, what's shown as one here, right? That's just the objective lens. The front focal plane is here where it says 7. So just an objective lens system here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lenses. That's just objective lens before we get to anything else. Okay. Notice that all of these lenses are held within basically an aluminum housing. And when this whole thing warms up, all these larger lenses, well, and the ones in between also physically move a little bit further away from the front focal plane. Okay. The location of the image formed by the objective lens moves away from the reticle. So what happens is that you start losing focus a little bit, and you also start picking up a parallax error. Okay. And if you pay attention, you grab your side focus turret, you adjust the focus slightly, and you are back in business. Except for powder burners, that's how it works. For airgun guys, that gets a little tricky once you adjust sight focus. Now, what distance you're at? Well, that's why Tyler has his sight focus wheel covered with 10,000 hieroglyphics and things like that, right? But if you, for most well-made riflescopes, unless there's something else wrong, if the temperature changes and you think you're picking up a zero shift, there is a 99.99% probability, assuming you have a nice scope, that what you're seeing is an added parallax error that you need to dial out. When I did some experiments about 2-3 years ago, I did it with 2 scopes. I warmed up, cooled down March and tangent theta. And the reason I looked at those 2 is that March has a very shallow depth of field. That's just how they're built. It's one of the reasons why I think Tyler uses them.
Yes.
Tangent is the opposite. It has a very deep depth of field. One of the positives of a very deep depth of field is I don't have to mess with the sight focus too much to see the target clearly and shoot. One of the negatives is that unless I take the time to rework the sight focus a little bit, I will have a little bit more of the accumulated parallax error. I'm reasonably good at mitigating it. It takes a little bit of practice, but I shoot plates. I'm typically not trying to shoot the tightest group on paper. So I'm willing to live with a little bit of this parallax error as long as I'm cognizant of it, and there are simple methods to make sure it's not too much, and you have to be always paying attention. With a riflescope that has very shallow depth of field, what happens is that if the image is in focus and the reticle is sharp, chances are your parallax is minimal. Very interesting. Okay. Well, the scope is what was I? Yeah. Typically, if everything is set up correctly, once you're in focus, you don't have a ton of parallax error. My best guess, what was happening, if it was not just an attempt to badmouth vortex, what was happening with the PRS guys, temperatures changed a little bit, they picked up a little parallax error, missed the target, said, oh my God, the zero shifted. Zero did not shift. Parallax error bars opened up a little bit.
Yep.
That's my best guess, but I'll do some experimentation. I have a couple of questions from John Lacourt. Does this also exist with second focal plane scopes? Yes, of course. Right. It exists with any front focal plane or second focal plane scope. Makes no difference. Thermal expansion is thermal expansion. It will show itself in a slightly different way because of how you perceive the reticle. Second focal plane scope, the reticle is perceived a little bit differently. But the scopes that Tyler shoots with, there's a second focal plane scopes. Right. And you have the same exact problems. One interesting question here, now as I'm thinking about it, is that because there's more metal and glass in front of the second focal plane scope, is the effect larger than it would be in a front focal plane?
It's interesting.
I need to think about it a little bit.
I used for probably 3 years, a Night Force Attacker 7-35 first focal plane before. So I think they came out with the second focal plane version maybe a year or two after. So I had both. And while I never really experienced the same kind of temperature sensitivities that I experienced with the March, for example, I probably saw it maybe just a touch in the second focal plane variant versus the front focal plane. I never saw it in that scope. But again, like I said before, in my experience, every single
scope's all different.
Yeah,
correct. But anyhow, you will see it in both. The effects will maybe slightly different in magnitude, but it is the same basic effect. And Scott is asking, Ilya, I think you may have skipped over why the scope expands and contracts, or I just missed it. I'm not entirely. You may want to clarify, right? So you have glass sitting inside of metal.
There you go.
When the metal gets warm, it gets bigger.
Yes.
When it cools down, it's smaller. I actually even wrote this down here. I'm going to get rid of Tyler for a moment. I don't know if you guys can see it over here. The expansion of aluminum is 0.0001. Okay, it's supposed to be 3. Basically, 13 millionth of an inch for a length of aluminum of 1 inch per degree Fahrenheit. So we are not talking about very large expansion. That's why when this whole thing happened, with this whole discussion happened, a couple of people mentioned, oh, could it be the expansion of the mounts? Extremely unlikely, right? Because if the temperature shifted by 100 degrees, right, you are still looking at 0.001 of an inch offset for a conventional single-piece mount, roughly, right? But to change the point of impact, the front and back of the mount have to expand at different rates. You have to start doing this, right? Just going up and down will not have this effect. So it is extremely unlikely. Can it happen if you warm up the clamp on a Picatinny rail? If it's not a very good mount, you can have strange effects. If this is a shitty mount and it's putting stress on the scope, you can have what is functionally is unrelieved stress, and you can have some strange thermal effects. But we can't. These are boundary cases, right, where something else is screwed up. In a decent scope, with a decent mount, with an honest shooter, if there is such a thing, we all miss and we go, oh, my scope was bad, my rifle was bad, the phase of the moon was getting in the way, there was a mild earthquake while I was missing,
Yes.
That kind of stuff.
Yes.
Okay, Scott says, yeah, so that's what I missed. I didn't bring up the CT of aluminum. Correct. So aluminum does expand. But for example, I don't know, what was it? I think it was Scott that I was chatting with a while back about mounts, for example, right? Why are almost all the mounts we have are made out of aluminum? Well, it's easier to machine, it's plenty strong, and it's light, etc. But also, steel is much more likely to have unrelieved stress in the material, and when it heats up, it does weird things. Aluminum has a lot. Stress relieving in aluminum is much easier, right? So that's one of the reasons why, unless in most cases unless it's somebody good, I don't recommend steel mounts.
Now, I did see mounts. I thought maybe they were made of carbon recently.
There are a couple of companies who are pushing that. Carbon fiber. They do these. Yeah. Forged carbon fiber, they call it something like that. There's a company in the US that does it, and somebody in Europe, not Aerotech, a German company, EWA, I think.
Yeah.
They've been talking about carbon fiber mounts. They're very expensive, and I don't fully understand, other than the pretty look, what the purpose is.
Yes, agreed.
No, it doesn't mean there isn't, right? I just want somebody to explain it to me, because I don't get it. With carbon fiber, depending on what kind of epoxy you're using, you can control thermal expansion comparatively well. But if you don't, you will have problems during with carbon fiber mounts during heat transitions.
That's when I started shooting field target, I had a Premier Reticle Loophole Competition 35, and it was an old one. And this was, I think, maybe before they had figured out the resin or epoxy that they were using for the reticle. And I left the scope out in the sun during a shoot, and I went to take about a 45-yard shot and completely missed the target because my scope was just gone. Like it was there was nothing I could do, you know?
Yeah. So when this whole thermal discussion thing was happening, somebody did ask me, is it possible that the epoxy that in some scopes, not all, but in quite a few of them, some of the lens elements are epoxied in? Is it possible that the epoxy is expanding and all that and causing shifts? Theoretically, yeah. In practice, not so much, because if the company, and Scott may have something to add to it, in practical terms, the way lens elements are epoxied into their holders, epoxy is applied radially, and it's a radially symmetric way. The only way I'm going to put that scope diagram back on, and you guys should be able to see the mouse moving on it, right? Yes, you do. Here's what happens. So the lens is here, the reticle is here. When we talk about optical systems, we talk about z-axis. Z-axis is longitudinal thing along the line, along the length of the scope. And xy would be y would be up, down, and x in this case would be in and out of the page. To get a zero shift due to temperature, you need to have a temperature-induced shift in the xy plane. Okay. To get a focus shift, you get a temperature-induced shift in the z-plane. And that is that is exactly what happens, because that's an unbalanced plane. You have a long piece of aluminum that gets a little bit longer, gets a little bit shorter. It moves everything around. To get this shift in the xy plane, you have to have something unbalanced. So if you have a lens epoxied around the whole perimeter, whatever is happening simultaneously in a somewhat balanced way. Now, if somebody screwed this up, you can have some sort of weird shift. But if that lens only had a piece of epoxy on one spot somewhere in the bottom, might self-destruct from recoil anyway, right? So you will have other problems.
What about glass expansion? I heard a manufacturer say this once, and I had to pause because I was not sure if I believed it or not.
Well, glass does expand. Everything, changes with temperature. Glass expansion is not huge, and it will have the same exact effect. It will cause some focus shifts. Okay, because the lens can get slightly thicker or slightly thinner. Unless all the lenses you see in the scope, they're radially symmetric, right? So if you go out from the optical axis in any direction, they will be shifting. The thickness is changing exactly the same way. So again, to have an XY shift, you have to have something there that is unbalanced. Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. Is it likely? Not hugely, I don't think. Is this all making sense, guys?
To me?
Yes, no, maybe. Yeah, there is a little bit of a delay, so there's like a 15-20 second delay after I say something. So we'll see if anything else happens in the comments. Also, looking at the time, Tyler has maybe 15-20. Yeah,
we had a question come in from our friend Cunt Bucket.
Oh, there we go. Right. If that scope is second focal point, how do you determine your holds? Does the projectile simply shoot flat enough at those distances? No, it doesn't.
No, it
doesn't. To negate the need for any more than a duplex reticle.
Sure. So for our hunter division, those guys are using some kind of ballistics program, right, that they can plug their reticle into, or depending on if it's a mill or MOA reticle. Many programs out there will spit out kind of your MOA or mill-based holds, and then they will kind of overlay that on a picture of the reticle and carry that around with them as a card. In my case, I have a program called Scope Knob, actually, that was made up by this guy that's like a airplane, whatever, I don't know, like an aero engineer type guy. who got into Field Target back in the 90s and created this kind of rudimentary program to help you figure out your dope. And it'll work for anything, but it's trajectory based. So I zero the gun at a distance. I plug in the distance into the program. I figure out how many clicks it is to 10 yards. So my closest distance, how many clicks it would be to 55 yards, which is my furthest distance. And you can use this for any other shooting application. You plug in a few other facts about your optic as well as your setup, so speed, things like that. And then you hit go and it just runs the numbers for you. And then you just print them out, put them on a sheet in a way that makes sense to you, and you're good to go. So I click adjust for everything. So I'm always holding in the center of the rifle.
Well, if you are doing any sort of a distance shooting, and distance means different things for air guns or for firearms, but distance is distance. If you cannot do point blank hold with a second focal plane scope, you should be dialing.
Yeah.
I know lots of traditional hunter types who like simple holdover reticles and second focal plane scopes. Don't like it when I say that. If you're using a second focal plane scope for distance, use the turrets.
Yeah.
That's the basic truth.
Yes.
Drew Morgan, professional certified rocket surgeon. Yes.
It's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. So Tyler's only has about 15-20 minutes left. If you guys have air gun questions or field target, now's the time to ask. He forgot more about that than I'll ever know. And once he has to go, I can take questions on optics if that comes up. But if anything you can think of on thermal expansion, on what field target guys do to mitigate that, if anything is unclear, now's the time.
I have a question for you, actually. So, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, so maybe you'll tell me to fuck off or something. You once told me
I might tell you that anyway, but yeah.
That's true. It's certainly possible. Wouldn't be the first time, I think. No. You once told me when we were having a conversation about this that you believe there is a way to completely mitigate the potential for maybe not thermal expansion, but what I perceive as temperature shift, right? In ranging. Mm-hmm. You told me that would cost a lot of money, more money than I have.
Correct.
Yes. What do you? I won't ask you for specifics because obviously that should be well guarded.
No. There's no magic to this, right? So in the camera world, and remember, I used to work on space programs a lot, etc. Mm-hmm. You can design mechanical systems where nothing moves. It's just expensive. There are different ways of doing this. One is you can have a counteracting. You can set this up with double, triple wall stuff and position elements so that when one moves here, another one moves here, and you can have this completely thermally compensated. You can make an internal carriage for your lenses out of something called Invar, for example. We use it in our test systems. Invar is a type of a steel alloy that basically has zilch thermal expansion. It's heavy, it's a bitch to machine, it's a horrible thing to work with, and it's fairly expensive. But it is possible. Okay, you can play a little bit with glass types and work it out so that the glass expansion counteracts the aluminum expansion. That gets very, very tricky. But for example, I'm going to bring up, and I'm just talking out of my ass, and Scott's sitting there laughing at me. For example, there we go. So this stuff at 8, that's the calling it the field lens. That's a thing that moves front and back when you adjust sight focus. That's what changes your focus. I can pick a metal alloy of some sort, mount this focus cell in that metal alloy in such a way that when aluminum expands, this thing moves in the opposite direction and compensates for the focus shift of the objective lens. Is it going to be absolutely perfect? No, but it's going to be close. That requires very precise machining, comparatively exotic materials, fair amount of space, because all of this stuff is not cheap. It's going to be big, heavy, expensive, etc. Can it be done? Yes.
What kind of cost?
It would be much easier to do with a front focal plane scope. You want your reticle to be in a front focal plane.
Yeah.
But it is possible.
Interesting. Yeah.
And for a lot of go ahead.
No, you're good. Go.
Yeah. So for a lot of camera systems that we put on, okay, is this anything restricted? Hold on. No, it's not restricted. For a lot of camera systems that we put on aerial vehicles, drones, and other things, think about the temperature differentials they go through, right? If you are up at, I don't know, 30, 40,000 foot, the ambient temperature is about minus 50 Fahrenheit ballpark, right? But if all of a sudden the sun hits you direct without atmospheric attenuation, temperature all of a sudden goes up. Lots of systems that look down from these platforms are fixed focus, right? And yet when you're looking down from them, focus hasn't shifted. Why? Well, because we do a slightly more complex mechanical holders, right? Where you position the material such that the expansion of one sleeve counteracts the expansion of another one, compensating.
So March came out a few years ago with this anti-drift lens system.
High master thing, yeah.
And I remember having a conversation with somebody on their side about what do I do if I'm still seeing this? Because they designed it, to my understanding, specifically for or based off of feedback from field target shooters. And I can tell you, I mean, the scopes still shift. They might be a little more
correct.
One thing I will say, March has always been very consistent in the way it shifts. Like when you hit a certain temperature, it goes, right? Sometimes finding that temperature range is the difficult part, but other scopes can move almost gradually over a 15 or 20 degree let's say temperature window, and that can be amazingly difficult to deal with. So it's not like the temperature shift in a March is insurmountable as a shooter, but I was hopeful that this new system would solve the problem, and at least for me, it has not.
So I don't know exactly what they did with the High Master system because I honestly never looked, and I don't remember if I ever asked them if they gave me an answer. I don't remember them. I don't remember ever asking them. I don't know for sure what they did. I know with the High Master system, they went to the Super ED lenses,
right,
which allowed them to do the optical compensation a little bit differently. So it's probably a little bit less sensitive to small shifts, and the lenses themselves are a little bit more thermally stable. But whether they did anything else there, I honestly don't know. I have looked at the thermal expansion on the March 5-42 with the front focal point scope. It does shift. It does, like you said, it shifts fairly predictably. It shifts less than the earlier 5-40 did.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. But almost everything shifts. Having talked to, there's an airgun shooter. She's a South African lady. Lives in Arizona, Lauren Parsons, I think. I think she was sponsored by Collis, and I think she was saying the Collis 10-50 didn't shift very much.
So I've owned one. By comparison to most, it does not shift in a discernible fashion. Like if it moves, I can't see it.
Correct. So I don't know for sure what they did differently because everything expands.
Yeah.
They could have added some compensation to it. Or it could be as simple as having just more depth of field. They're long scopes, right?
Sure. That is true. Actually, it does have it's not nearly as shallow as a March is. That's true.
Correct. So your rangefinder will be a little bit harder.
Yeah. Well, what they did on the Collis, which was interesting. So if you guys will notice, so you notice I have a good amount of space between 10 and 11. That space between 10 and 11 is about the same as the space between 50 and 55. On a Collis, the space between 10 and 20 is the same as the space between 40 and 50.
So that's interesting.
There's something in that top focus mechanism that they. I don't know if it's geared or something, but it is really, really well balanced. So yes, it doesn't snap quite as well. Like that depth of field is not the same, but it seems to be temperature stable. And once you figure out how to use it, they're pretty good. I think it's overpriced for what it is by comparison to a March because the optical experience is not as nice, but
it's not close. Yeah,
that's my opinion.
Okay, we have a couple of questions here. Let's hit them before you have to go. William Brown, counterfeit aluminum has been a problem in manufacturing for a bit now. And by counterfeit, it's usually way off in formula. That's possible. I mean, there are different aluminum alloys do very different things. So, and you can have, again, if you have something that's not properly stress relieved, you can have weird effects. When brown Fujinon lenses are like that, and they are several $100,000 used. So, Fujicon, I am guessing he meant Fujinon. So the lenses you're talking about, several $100,000, those are movie lenses. And all these parfocal lenses that I use for movies, one of the reasons why they are as expensive as they are is that when you change zoom, change focal length, etc., the focus doesn't shift, and the focus stays extremely consistent with temperature as well. Oh, hold on a sec. I have something. It's not a super expensive lens, and this actually is a Fujinon. This is a Fujinon broadcast lens. I'll show you. Okay. So this is one of the cameras I worked on. The range of focal lengths for this lens is from 8.6 millimeters to 172 millimeters. And you put this in front of the camera and you go through the zoom range. There is no focus shift at all, and there is no magnification shift at all. Right? So it's extremely predictable going either direction. Okay. So yeah, these kind of things exist in camera lenses. Camera lenses are, especially video lenses, are much more sophisticated than, from an optical standpoint, than objective lenses and riflescopes. But they also don't have to design them to survive recoil. If you put that on a gun, fun things can happen. Now, as field target gets bigger, since you guys don't have anything remotely resembling recoil, maybe somebody's going to come up with a winning formula for a scope that doesn't have to be as ruggedized, but you can do more complicated mechanical stuff.
Yeah, people shoot spring guns in field target. It's a separate division. So
never mind. Yeah. Those, I mean, honestly, I don't think they're worse than powder burners. It's just different recoil direction.
Yes.
But they hit you. They bang up optics.
Yes.
Okay. So Drew Morgan is asking a question about low power variables. I can probably address it later, unless you want to know. I actually did a video on that, why low power variables have small objectives, a few years ago. Mr. Blind Spotter. I've always been interested in field target, curious how they balance gear versus pure shooter skill. It's a constant debate in PRS. I'm curious how field target handles it, non-optics. Probably about the same as PRS. People are people, but please go ahead.
That's almost dead on what I was going to say, yeah. I'll use a buddy of mine who's won a couple national championships in the hunter division. His name's Bill Rabbit. Bill had been shooting field target for about 1.5 years, 2 years when he won his national championship. The first one, I think 2016 or so. And he did so with a $500 gun and a $400 Hawk scope. He's a great shot. And he learned the gun. He worked on the gun. He learned it inside and out, learned the scope inside and out. A couple years later, he transitioned over to a Thomas rifle, which is what I shoot as well, which is a $4,000 custom-made for you rifle that, as far as air guns go, it's the simplest thing out there and also one of the most accurate, stable systems that's been built today, as far as air guns go, of course. And he won, he's won multiple titles with it. Nothing changed. Bill's a great shooter. I've shot a number of guns over the years. I've won a lot of matches. It's if you put a capable gun, all the guns out there are as accurate as everything else. Once you learn the gun, once you learn the scope, if you're a good shooter, you'll probably rise to the top. It's that simple. But I understand the question 100%. It's something we get a lot. You don't need the best equipment to win. There are guys out there that shoot 10, 15-year-old guns that are consistently performing at the top because they know the equipment and they themselves are very competent shooters. It's pretty simple.
That sounds about right. And to be clear, right? So Tyler is a good shot. Scott Parks from Vortex, who is, I think, still hanging around here somewhere. I don't know how good Scott was in his peak, but he was probably top 10 in the country, PRS-wise, close to it. And he was shooting 308 when everybody else was shooting 6.5s and stuff. So John LaCour doesn't talk about it much. He knows a thing or two about shooting, and I suspect quite a few other people here shoot. I've seen almost no one who, after missing a shot, has not at least a couple times blamed the equipment. But if you're honest with yourself, usually when the emotions have come down half hour or so later, most of the time you know it's not the equipment.
Yes.
Now, it can be the equipment. The equipment has failed. Things can happen. I've had shots where to this day, I'm convinced it was something because the shot broke just right and I missed. But I always have this thing in the back of my mind. What exactly did I fuck up?
It's a fair question. Always a fair question.
Most of the time, it's going to be me.
Yeah.
So that's just that. Okay. I'm going to skip the thermal optics question because that's not a simple answer. I will answer that. The question is, the answer is no, and there is a reason for it. Also from Con Bucket, probably the last question you have to address. Also, could you have a target in the competition shaped like a break-dancing midget?
So we have like all sorts of different targets. We have a Sasquatch target, like Roadrunner.
Hey, what did I do?
Yeah. We've got Roadrunner, Wile the Coyote. Like so sure. What I want to do is make we're going to go down a rabbit hole here, and I apologize to you and all of your listeners. I would like to make a penis-shaped target, okay? That when you shoot the kill zone, the target falls and it ejects like lotion or something into the air, because that would be fucking hilarious to me, okay? I have a problem.
It would. Yeah. It really would. You should do it. So the gentleman there used to be this optics company called Millet Optics. Bushnell bought them and killed them eventually. And now Bushnell, I think, is in death throes. The guy who first started making semi-decent scopes with Millet, his name was Steve Miller. He's an interesting guy. For shits, he was a former army officer guy. He kind of had a sense of humor. He passed away a few years ago, so I'm not going to say bad things about him. But he once, for shits and giggles, when he went to China, they made him a scope where the reticle was like Jessica Rabbit and the aiming point was the right nipple.
Yep.
It was hard to shoot with that scope accurately, but one of the most enjoyable shooting experience I've had.
I remember there was a club down in Louisiana that hosts the longest running field target match in the country called the Cajuns, of course. They have a target that is Yosemite Sam, and you shoot the guns out of his hands. So it's actually a 2-piece target.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, you can't do it anymore in the rules, but they split. You'd get a half a point for each hand or gun that you shot away. So yeah, there's all sorts. I've seen targets made like chronographs. So when you hit the target, it actually runs numbers like a chronograph telling you the velocity.
That's very cool.
Yeah, people make all sorts of fun stuff like light up targets. Yeah, it's very interesting. We've got tanks, planes, whatever you want, you name it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you guys, if you have not tried field target and you have some money to burn, give it a shot. For his day job, Tyler works for Pyramid Air, so they supply all sorts of air gun related stuff. I've bought a few things from them. They all shoot better than I do.
Most of the stuff,
not that hard, but field target is, I think, the fastest growing precision shooting sport in the world by a solid margin. Probably faster than any powder burner stuff. And because the different distances are somewhat limited, it's much easier to set up a complicated field target course than it is to set up a proper long-range course, like this Burris Optics Challenge in Wyoming that I went to last month. You need a lot of space for that.
Yeah.
You don't need so much for field target. So there are advantages, and I suspect many matches are a lot more accessible because of it.
Yes.
And
it's also,
once you've invested... Yeah, go ahead.
I've not been to many other shooting events in my time. I shoot a lot of 3D archery now, but PRS matches. It seems like a very competitive, but also like sort of collaborative environment, depending on who you're shooting with.
Yes.
But field target is probably the most. Field target shooters will hand you the shirt off their back if it means you stick around, right? So I've watched guys have their guns go down in the middle of the match, and the guy they're shooting with hands them their gun and says, you're not going home, you're finishing, right? And they'll walk them through everything they need to. So it's a really good time, and if you have your club near you, you should definitely go check it out. It's I'm sure you could get somebody to loan you a gun. It would be no problem. AAFTA.org is where you'd find all the clubs, and AFTA is the governing body for field target in the U.S. So
very cool. Yeah. Most shooting sports people are friendly. Every once in a while, I hear about some things happening at PRS matches. I've gone to a couple of Narwhal Hunter matches. People are super nice. At this competition dynamics match I went to in June, they were awesome. I brought my kids to watch. Sky Layton from Burris, and after the competitors were done, coached my kids through to hitting a few plates past 400 yards and stuff. My kids are 11 and 12; they're fairly young and new to shooting. He was so happy. He was much happier than if than for anything he would have done himself, right? So it's a good environment.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. Anything else for Tyler? Last few moments, I think. I don't see much. We'll see if anything else pops up. So if anything pops up once Tyler has to leave, I can ask him offline and get you an answer. It's not especially difficult. Do you have to run, Tyler? Is it about time?
I've got a couple minutes. Yeah, I'm good for maybe
okay.
10 minutes or so.
So here's a question that is a little bit off the left field, but interesting, from Mr. Cunbucket. Are there any thermal optics with a HUD, heads-up display, showing ambient temperature to help ease the process of sorting the shifting occurrences? Perhaps something similar to the Burriscopes. Burriscopes, he's referring to our Veracity pH that have a little display at the top of the image. Arabic scopes do the same thing. Steiner IFS, there are a few. So what you are asking for is some sort of a radiometrically accurate thermal camera. So not all thermal cameras are created equal. The thermal cameras that are thermal riflescopes that we look at, they do not tell you the exact temperature which you're looking at. All they tell you is something is hotter or colder, right? If it's a lot hotter, it's going to look very different. If it's a lot colder, it's going to look very different. Slightly hotter, slightly colder. It's going to be similar. Measuring the actual temperature which you're looking at becomes very tricky because there are a couple of things here that are involved. One is the temperature of the object. Another one is that object's emissivity. There is something called Kirchhoff's law that if you've ever done electrical wiring, you may have seen. It also works for some optical phenomena. What it basically means is that if you are looking at an object, what you're seeing from it is a combination of three things. Self-emission, if you're looking with a thermal camera. Reflection, something bouncing off. That's how our eyes normally see. We see the reflected bands. And transmission, if this object you're looking at is not perfectly opaque, right? Whatever you're getting from it is a sum of those three things. Okay. So to figure out how hot it is, you need to know exactly the emission of it. If there's also stuff reflecting, coming through, etc., how do you know how much of that energy you're sensing is actually emitted? It becomes an extremely non-trivial thing. When you can look at two objects that are of exactly the same temperature. One of them is a little bit more reflective, a little bit shinier. Another one is very matte. The matte one is going to have usually higher emissivity, right? And if the object sits at 100 degrees and has 90% emissivity, to a thermal camera, it will look like a 90-degree object. If it has 80% emissivity, to a thermal camera, it will look like an 80-degree object. Thermal camera cannot tell which is which. There are some tricks to help with that. They get expensive. You can do multispectral imaging, Planck curve fitting, all sorts of fun stuff. And we do it, but we're not doing it for the price you pay for a thermal riflescope. I just spent a week at White Sands Missile Range helping a friend of mine teach a class on radiometric imaging. Radiometric imaging is exactly this, how to image with thermal cameras and actually figure out the temperatures of the stuff you're looking at. There are some secondary clues and all that, right? And there were a few cameras we're using there, and the cheapest, I think, was about 60 grand. That's the cheapest. So in theory, is it possible to set up a thermal camera measure the exact temperature of the object to figure it out? Yes. Is it feasible? No. Do you really need it? Also probably no, right? Because the temperature you care about is the temperature of the rifle scope, not temperature of the target.
Yes.
So you could add a little thermistor to a rifle scope and have a digital readout that tells you its temperature. That you can do. That is comparatively straightforward. And quite a few rifle scopes, like the Steiner FS and Revik and others, they actually have that data because they monitor the ambient temperature. Right? So in principle, you could do that. Okay. But doing that with a thermal optic is not really viable. But there's the idea, Tyler, right? So you can have a well-behaving scope like the March and build in a little thermistor so you can constantly monitor temperature and adjust.
What are you talking about? You mean my fish tank thermometer is not good enough?
No, it is not.
Yeah, well,
but it gets you kind of in the ballpark.
Yeah, look, it's whatever you're using to measure this, you have to figure out a methodology that works accurately for you. So I know that usually the temperature of the scope lags, the inside temperature of the scope, this, internals is lagging the outside, right? The question is like, as you set up a scope, and this takes months to do, sadly, you have to figure out, okay, is when it says 75, is that different in terms of what my range results are? Or when I hit 90, is that where it starts to move, right? Like, this takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's not fun. It's not fun. But
it's tedious. It sounds tedious.
It is. But, it's one of those things, if you want to try and shoot perfect scores, which happens very, very rarely in field target, it's something you have to figure out.
That is probably true. Yeah. Anyhow, Mr. Kahnbacher, I hope that answers your question. Maybe not. But if you want to look into this deeper, if there are enough people want it, I'll explain how Planck curves work and how you could curve fit that and potentially figure out the real temperature of an object. But it's implementations of it are, they've been done, they are done on a regular basis, but it's not trivial and it is very expensive.
Interesting.
So that's that. All right. What else did I miss? I know I missed something. There was a question.
The LPVO question.
Oh, yeah, the LPVO question. Let's talk about that. So I do have a video on it. If I remember, I'll try to put that into the link where I sketch out a bunch of stuff that happens. And maybe I should do a quick sketch. So before I get to that, Mr. Scott Parks, if you're still there, did I miss anything on the thermal expansion question, or did we successfully beat it to death? Before we fully wrap up with that, if anything else comes down on the thermal expansion and thermal shifts, now's the time to ask. And if not, we'll talk about why don't we see low power variable scopes with larger objectives. Okay. And there is actually a company that makes a 1-7 rifle scope with a 42 millimeter objective, because they used to. I'm trying to remember their name. It wasn't Brasser. No.
Don't they make one like
guys? No. It was a Chinese scope. And it had shallow depth of field and very, very, very narrow field of view. Okay. And here is why. Let's see how much of. Okay, this is the part of the board we're seeing. Let's sketch stuff up. So you have an objective, you have a tube. Somewhere here, there's a front focal plane. You have a turret. Somehow, every time I draw a rifle scope, it looks like a very weird dildo. I don't know how that works. You guys see it? Yeah. Okay. Probably because I insist on drawing the lens as the tip. What objective lens in a low power variable scope does, it gets and focuses the light on the front focal plane. This is where the reticle is in a front focal plane scope. The second focal plane reticle would be here, and it would get re-imaged so down in the second focal plane. What happens if, let's say, you want to take this objective and make it larger? Oh, Scott has a question for you. Tyler, have you ever thought about using a laser pyrometer and heat gun to do this?
Not a heat gun. Yes. I have done it before. The problem is that depending on what the ambient temperature is, it can cool off too fast to really do it effectively. And having that like blowing right next to your face to keep it semi-consistent is a fucking awful experience. We have some of those space heaters at the office. So when I want to check, in the winter, what my warm numbers might look like, I will sit directly under one of those and let the scope heat up. But really, especially for the cold stuff, you really have to suffer through a day in the kind of late fall, early winter, and let the scope get down to the 40s and 50s and do it that way. So the heat stuff is very doable. Yes, you could certainly do it that way. But the cold stuff is where, and actually the cold is probably where you get the harder to explain shifts in my experience.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like you can, most scopes that I've had anyway, when you get up to a certain temperature range, they stop moving, right? That once they hit that high temperature shift, they stop moving, and it could go to, I don't know, 100+ degrees on the scope, and it's not going to shift any differently. But in the cold, I've seen, there's like moderately cold, 50 degrees, let's say Fahrenheit. And then if you shoot in just above freezing conditions, I've seen many scopes have little shifts in between those two. I don't know why, of course, and could just be the one or two that I've shot that cold with. But yeah, that was a little bit different, I guess. Not expected.
Oh, I'll need to give it a little bit of thought. So Scott, maybe you should pop on an environmental chamber and figure it out.
There you go.
I have an environmental chamber at work. I can have it pointed into a collimator and measure what's happening as it cools down. Interesting idea. Okay. Oh, Mr. Wolfward is asking a question. General optics question is, when is someone going to make a CMRAD style thermal clip-on for a rifle scope? Seems like it would be pretty simple to move the display lens and solve so many overall length issues with scopes. You're talking about a clip-on that's not in line, right? Is that what you mean? What do you mean by CMRAD? I assume that's what it means.
Ilya, I have to jump, my friend. It was.
All right, Tyler.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you guys have questions for Tyler? Let me know, and we'll get those squared away.
Sounds good. See ya.
Okay, so Tyler is gone. I only had him for an hour, but again, it's theory is all good, but field target guys have been dealing with these temperature shifts for quite a long time. So for Mr. Wolford, yeah, you can. It's commonly done, just not in the civilian world. But then what happens is you have to take this digital image and inject it into a rifle scope. There are a couple of different ways of doing this. One, you can do it optically. Another one, you can do it electronically. Vortex's XM157 scope, for example, is capable of such a thing. I don't think they've implemented it, but technologically, it is capable of such a thing. So is it coming? Yeah. When is it coming to the civilian world? Hard to say. It's still comparatively expensive. Okay. I'll get back to the LPVO question. I'll answer that, and then I'll see what other questions are in the comments. Okay. So you have a low power variable. What happens if you decide you're going to make a large objective? I'm going to draw it as green. Okay. If you just make the objective larger, the F number of your objective lens system has just gone up substantially, right? Because your focal length did not change. The objective lens got bigger. So you picked up a ton of aberrations. Your depth of field got shallow. And you started having all sorts of issues. Now it's no longer a particularly flexible design. Okay. Or Scott Simrad sits above the scope and uses an inline beam splitter in front of the scope. Yeah, you can do that. A company called Mastack, their X4 thing that I using actually uses a very similar thing. It's not terribly hard to do. You don't need to have a mounting system where the thermal is properly lined up to the scope. You can do that kind of bore sighting. It does start getting a little bit expensive. And if you use that method, you're also degrading the performance of the day optical system. If I were doing it, I'd be looking for a way to inject the image from the thermal electronically. I think that can be done in a better way, but yeah, both are viable. Okay. But anyhow, low power variables, right? So if you just grow the objective, you start running into issues. Okay, so what if I want to retain the F number of the objective lens system? And now my it's not just depth of field, Drew Morgan, because now you start the image quality also goes down. You start having a much more complicated optical system, and now you have to adjust things all the time, right? What happens if I make this optical objective lens system longer? Just move the objective up forward, make the focal length longer. Well, now if you want the same field of view, the image size in the reticle plane gets a lot bigger. So if you want to retain the same field of view, your tube just doubled in diameter, and everything just went to hell. Everything bigger behind it started getting bigger because you need to have all these different optical systems match. Okay. And so on and so forth. And it ends up being a little bit of this avalanche of problems that you start having when you try to get objective lens a little bit bigger. There are a couple that have made them bigger, 28 millimeters and 30 millimeters. And the ones that did it really well, the scope, it's hard to shrink the scope. Delta Striker 110x28 is compared to a compact, but didn't make the objective much bigger. Blazer 127x28, I think, is still optically one of the best LPVOs out there, but it's big and heavy. And this is one of the reasons, right? You will either lose a ton of depth of field, which is not a good thing, or you will run into a variety of other issues. Okay, guys, I need to go do something real quick. I'll be right back. I am back. All right. Mr. Parks decided to jump in while I had to make a very necessary detour. Goes into LPVO is already very sensitive, short focal length, and complicated optical systems. Correct. Another thing to keep in mind is that the purpose for LPVO's existence is not low light performance. They actually give modern LPVOs give you pretty decent low light performance, but the purpose for the existence is not that. It's good performance on 1x and reasonable engagement at mid distances. And if you're going to be shooting something in the dark, you should have a thermal clip on anyway. With low power variables, the modern drive in design trends is not to make them bigger, it's to make them smaller. Because for what they're used for, size is a distinct advantage. Okay. I hope that makes some sort of sense. Drew Morgan, to be honest, my thinking is that LPVO should stay 1 to 4 or so. Yes and no. So I've had this conversation with quite a few manufacturers. I think there is a space in the market for 1 to 4 LPVOs, but I want them tiny. If I could get a 6-inch long, low power variable, it's 1 to 4, 1 to 3, I'd love to have one, right? But look at Vortex's AMG 1 to 10, was it about 8 inches long? March Shorty 1 to 10, about 8 inches long, 8.2, something like that. These are extremely competent and very compact designs, but they are hideously complicated to make. Could it be possible to make a 1 to 4 that's 6 inches long? I would even go for a small objective diameter. If I could get a 1 to 4 by, I don't know, 20, that's less than 6 inches long, I think it would make a killing. The problem with it is marketing, because everybody is convinced that bigger is always better. And with optical systems, smaller is oftentimes harder. Well, very big is hard and very small is hard. Okay. All right, is this all making sense? Very good. Alrighty. This I originally did not intend. I think I can get the headset out. Since Tyler's not here, I don't need to hear anyone. Wolford, I agree. I'm looking more for an alkane alternative than a 1 to 10 compact. I like the idea of having both, but they serve a somewhat different thing, right? A 1 to 10, good quality 1 to 10, is really a general purpose scope in many ways, because I have an AR set up with a 1 to 10, Razor Gen 3 in this case, and I can go pretty fast up close and personal, and I can hit things 900 yards or so out, and it works well in between. It's a little bit of everything in a pinch type of gun. A 1 to 4 does some of that, but not the whole thing. Where the ultra short designs really start playing a role is that there's been a bit of a trend toward compact rifle, AR-15 pistols for civilians with fairly short guns. Many military organizations are looking at somewhat shorter barrels because they natively come with suppressors. The whole package is getting more compact. You don't have a ton of rail space. So short designs, I think, have an advantage. And that's probably one of the reasons why the Alcan Spectre DR 1 to 4 still had, in the last 2-3 years, had a couple of nice wins in Europe, I think in Germany and Denmark. They got designed in. It wasn't, it's a switch power scope and principles a little bit more limiting and all that, but they're optically good and they're compact. So there's that. Okay. All right, gentlemen. I didn't originally intend for this to be my customary long live stream. I wanted to pick Tyler's brain and see if I can put this business with thermal zero shift more or less to rest. Every once in a while, these things kind of start as a rumor at the PRS competition and then take on a life of their own. Some guy repeats it to another, he repeats it to another, and 5 people down the line, it has morphed into something else entirely. And when I first saw this thing, I just thought it's unlikely. And I still think it is unlikely. I will do the experiment with the Razor Gen 3 when I have a chance. But I would be shocked if a zero shift with temperature is any sort of a thing with high quality rifle scopes. Okay. All right, let me see if there is anything else in the comments that I missed. And if there is nothing else, I am going to bid you good night and go try to avoid weight loss, something I'm traditionally very good at. And we'll see. Right, I think I got everything that is in the chat box. Right, I'll give you guys five more minutes. If nothing else comes up, we'll part ways for tonight. And in case you're wondering, I'm back to drinking water just out of the same glass. Despite what you may think watching my live streams, I am not an alcoholic. Okay, Mr. William Brown, thanks for the live stream. You are very welcome. Thank you guys for chiming in. I'm using a somewhat different a streaming service. I'm using a studio from Rumble. And what the unfortunate effect of it is I'm able to stream to my locals website and everywhere from Rumble. But on YouTube, it does not post it in advance, right? So you only know there's a stream on YouTube once it starts. But on Rumble and on locals, it does. Wolford, I suspect a lot of people don't recognize temp shift with ammo as well. Lots of ammo shifts, but again, I've looked at it a little bit. I didn't look at it super hard. I haven't looked at it super hard. The velocities do change. It does not mean there is a big difference up close and personal, but once velocity changes, you will have stringing or vertical shifts at distance, and the further out you go, the more you see it. And Mr. Scott Parks from Vortex chimed in, says, for peace of mind and always trying to keep an open mind, we have tested this 6 ways to Sunday. And I don't doubt they did that. I've visited Vortex enough times. They do take this stuff seriously, and they do have the means and the facilities to test everything very, very thoroughly. It's not that I don't trust them, but, you know, I like doing experiments, and for my own sanity, there are a couple of things that I can do. I just need to. Tyler kind of gave me an interesting data point I didn't think of before. He said that they see weird things more at cold temperatures and hot temperatures. So, and he did mention he starts seeing it and gets a little bit cold at 40, 50 degrees. So I'm going to need to give it a little bit of thought and see how I can, with comparative ease, simulate a stable 40-degree environment and see if there is something unusual that can be found there. Scott, have you guys looked at colder temperatures as well? But even then, like I said, from what Tyler is saying, he's seeing focus shifts. He's not seeing zero shifts. Even through, and these guys are super thorough with how they test this. And the air guns they shoot are so stunningly accurate. And these guys are good. If there was anything there, they would see it. I'm probably just going to put this thing in front of the collimator and find a way to cool it down, warm it up, and see. And I expect to see focus shifts. I do not expect to see zero shifts. Okay. So I think that's that. I think we beat this one to death, so we're gonna wrap up. Thank you all for sticking with me. Thank you, Scott from Vortex, for chiming in. I do appreciate it. And I know you've, I know you guys have addressed this, but I should as well. Wolford, what sort of tolerance for temperature would you like? I wonder if liquid crystal strips would be sufficient. The problem with temperature here is that I need it consistent. It can't be localized. You need to give it a chance to spread around the scope, something that simulates just being in a cold place. So I can think of a couple of ways of doing this. I'll need to see. I need to see what is more practical. And on top of it, I'll be honest with you, for me personally, being mostly a firearm shooter, not an airgun shooter, I don't usually care. I just sight focus and I'm good. And if there is a zero shift there, I'm not a good enough shot to see it. And I have a strong suspicion that nobody's a good enough shot to see it. If the field target guys don't see it, we don't either. I mean, that's just the truth of it. These guys are seriously good. So, anyhow, thank you all. You have a good night. If there's anything I missed, please put it in the comments and I'll address it the best I can. And if you have not seen Field Target, go watch some videos. It is impressive. These guys are seriously good. Okay. Wooford goes, they're basically stickers you can attach to scope body. It will change colors according to temp. Yeah, I'm not worried about reading temperature, right? I have the means to do so. I am curious about cooling it down, keeping the temperature sufficiently consistent long enough to see as the scope stabilizes to see shifts. I think I can think of a way of doing it. Anyhow, thank you all and good night.